My entitled neighbor tried to break into my house and steal my grandma's family heirlooms, so I got him imprisoned and had his kids taken away. When my grandmother passed away, her house was inherited by my father, who passed away just 3 days later after being hit by a drunk driver. The house went to me, and on my first day after moving in, my neighbor Todd showed up with his 2 young kids. As soon as I opened the door, he started interrogating me as to why he and his kids weren't invited to my grandma's funeral. Before I could respond, he demanded I give him a copy of her will. According to him, his kids were like family to her and should get whatever heirlooms they wanted with his kids. Ran past him and into the house, then started rummaging through drawers. His daughter stumbled upon a ring that had been passed down 3 generations and was set to go to my aunt, and she put it. I told Todd to get her to take the ring off, but he refused. He said again his kids were like family to her, but I yelled that grandma hated them, they were entitled and did what they liked, and even ruined her lawn with dog poop. I threatened to call the cops unless his daughter took the ring off, and that's what made him listen. His daughter screamed she didn't want to and even hit Todd, but the ring eventually came off. As he left, he yelled this wasn't finished and that he'd get his heirlooms in the end. He wasn't lying when he said this wasn't finished, as in the following days he started dropping by unannounced. He found every excuse to bring up the will, his kids, or what he thought grandma would have wanted. He had the nerve to act as though his kids were the rightful heirs, and often through guilt trips about how much they loved her and how devastated they were to not have a piece of her memory. It was all nonsense. One evening, after a really draining day of sorting through my father's things, I came home to find Todd standing on my front porch with a box of donuts. He had a grin on his face that made my skin crawl, and before I could even ask what he was doing there, he launched into some story about how his daughter had cried herself to sleep, heartbroken over not getting anything of grandma's stuff. He ended his speech by offering me a donut. He went on to say that he wanted to talk neighbor to neighbor. I flat out told him that neither he nor his kids were getting anything we'd already been through. This, I walked past him and his donuts and left them on the porch. Looking dumbfounded, he didn't say anything as I closed the door, but I could feel his eyes on me through the window for far too long before he finally walked away. Things quieted down for a few days after that, and I started to think maybe Todd had finally gotten the message. About a week later, I came home from running errands and found Todd and his 2 kids at my front door. His son was standing there trying to pick the lock with a screwdriver, while Todd stood behind him coaching like this was some kind of life lesson. It took me a second to even register what I was seeing, and then I lost it. I shouted at them as I ran up to the doorway. Todd turned around and looked startled for maybe half a second before his face slipped into an irritating fake smile. He tried to calm me down and told me that it wasn't what it looked like. He said my door was stuck and that he thought that they could help me out. I told him yeah, it was stuck by a lock to keep people like you out. His son dropped the screwdriver and Todd's daughter shrank behind him, but Todd just kept smiling. He acted as if this was all one big misunderstanding. He told me there was no need to call the cops and that it was just a mistake. I'd have to have idiot written across my forehead if he thought I was buying that. For a second, I kicked him and his little hoodlums off my property and told them if they pulled that stunt again, I'd call the cops. He opened his mouth to argue, but I wasn't about to let him get another word. And I pulled out my phone and hovered my finger over the call button, which seemed to do the trick. Todd threw his hands up in mock surrender and sure enough left. Just as quickly as they had come, I stood there for a long time after they were gone. My heart was still racing. I knew I should have called the police right then and there, but something stopped me. I thought it was maybe the exhaustion. Against my better judgment, I let it go. A few days later, I noticed something was off. I had been slowly packing up boxes in the garage and storing away the sentimental things that I wasn't ready to go through. Yet one afternoon, I went to grab a few boxes to bring inside, and that's when I realized several of them were missing my grandmother's old photos, letters, and even some of the jewelry she had given me. All of it was gone. I knew it was Todd. Who else would have the audacity to break into my garage and steal from me? But with no proof, I didn't know what to do. I couldn't exactly storm over to his house and demand my things back, so I did the only thing I could. I filed a police report. The cops came, took down my statement, and told me there wasn't much they could do without proof. It felt like a slap in the face. I was beyond pissed, but there was nothing I could do. I confronted Todd the next day. Of course, I walked right up to him while he was watering his lawn and demanded to know if he had taken my stuff. He just looked at me with that same smug smile and denied everything. I told him that I knew it was him because he was the only one who knew about there being valuables in the house. Think about it. If a burglar came in the middle of the night, why would he break into the garage and leave the rest of the house untouched? He denied the accusation with a smile, his smile paired with his denying the truth. Maybe I knew I wouldn't get far this way, so I told him I'd pay him to at least get the photos of my grandmother. I told him he could keep anything else in there that was of value, but I needed the photos of my grandma. Those were the last ones I had of her. His eyes showed me he was remorseful, but his mouth told me that he was sorry for my loss. But it wasn't him who stole the boxes. He blamed one of my friends who helped me move, and my blood boiled, and I knew if I had stayed there a moment longer, bad things would have happened. Todd wasn't going to admit to anything, and without proof, there wasn't much I could do, so I did the next best thing. I installed cameras. It took me a few days to get everything set up, but when the cameras were in place, I felt a little bit of relief if Todd or his brats tried anything again. I have proof. It was early evening. I heard a knock on my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, but when I opened it, there stood Todd's kids, his son all wide-eyed and hopeful, and his daughter standing behind him looking bored. The boy bounced a little on his toes and said that their dad had told him I should come over for dinner that night. I stared at him. The last thing I wanted was to sit down for a meal with the man who had been trying to steal from me for weeks. I told the boy I was busy that night, and before I could close the door, he yelled, "But we're family." He was really laying it on thick. The kid was practically bouncing in excitement like this was some grand invitation. He said that grandma would want us to eat together. I could feel my heart tighten at the word family. My grandmother had never considered these kids family. Still, Jason wasn't going to let it go. He grabbed Sarah's hand and yanked her forward. He begged and begged. Sarah rolled her eyes, clearly uninterested in playing along. Yeah, whatever, she muttered, not even bothering to make eye contact with me. I had an overwhelming feeling that Todd was up to something again. Thought of sitting at a table with him, maybe want to slam the door in their faces, but the kids were only doing what their father was telling them to. I guess I couldn't fault them. Jason leaned in closer to me and batted his eyes. "Please, it'll make Dad so happy," he said. To me, I should have said no. I really wanted to say no, but for some reason, the words didn't come out. I agreed and said I'd stay just for dinner, but I'm not staying long. Jason cheered, grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her back toward their house. When I got to Todd's, the smell of something roasting in the oven filled the house. Todd greeted me like nothing had ever happened between us. He still had the plastered smile that he'd always had. He was far too cheerful for my liking, but I sat down at the table. Anyway, Sarah slouched in her chair, barely paying attention while Jason ran around to help set the table as if it were his life's mission. As we sat down, Todd excused himself to go to the kitchen to finish up the last meal. I was about to dig into my plate when I noticed Sarah glancing at me, then at her plate. She fidgeted a little and bit her lip before switching her plate with mine. It was quick, but I caught it. I asked her what she was doing, and she shrugged. Looking at me, she said it was nothing. Before I could say anything else, Todd called from the kitchen asking if we were all ready to eat. Jason was already halfway through his food, and Sarah sat back staring at the plate she had just switched. Then, just as Todd walked back into the room, Sarah's plate slipped from her hands and crashed to the floor, food scattering everywhere. Todd rushed over to her, frowning. Sarah said she'd go get another plate and walked to the kitchen while Todd cleaned up the mess. Todd and his kids had climbed over the fence the night before, broke into my shed and rummaged through my things. They had even tried to start a bonfire with the old photo albums. I was done playing nice. I called the police again, and this time I had proof. When the officers arrived, I showed them the footage, and they finally took me seriously. Todd, of course, tried to play it off as another misunderstanding, claiming his kids were just cleaning up after some teenagers had trashed the yard, but the police weren't buying it this time. They warned him to stay off my property or face legal consequences. I thought that would be the end of it. Todd had been caught red-handed, and the police had finally stepped in. A few days later, I came home to find a for sale sign planted in my front yard. At first, I thought it was some kind of prank, but then I saw Todd standing there talking to a couple as if he were showing them the house. I marched right up to him and asked him what he thought he was doing. He grinned, not even the least bit ashamed. Instead, he was just helping me out. He figured I could use some new owners for this place since I seemed so overwhelmed with work for the house and the paperwork. He used the excuse I had given him a few nights before against me, but I wasn't about to argue with him. I was done. I yanked the sign out of the ground and called the police again. This time, they issued a formal warning telling Todd to stay off my property or face serious charges, but of course, Todd didn't listen. A few days later, I woke up to find my car vandalized. The tires were slashed and the windows were smashed. It was a nightmare. I didn't even need to check the cameras to know who was responsible. I called the police. They took my report, and when they reviewed the security footage, there was no doubt about it. Todd and his kids had been caught red-handed, again sneaking onto my property in the dead of night to vandalize my car. This time, Todd was arrested. As they hauled him away, he shouted about how the house should have been his and how I had no right to hog it all for myself. With Todd finally behind bars, his kids were left without a guardian. Their mother had been out of the picture for years, and they were placed into foster care. I felt bad about the kids and almost considered taking them in myself. It wasn't their fault that their dad was raising them wrong, and now that they were in the system, their life would be 12 times worse. But the neighborhood was quiet for the first time in what felt like forever. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders as I watched them drive Todd away. It was over. The nightmare was finally over.